Let's talk about how it impacts other people. And this is what happens oftentimes with family, right? Is that even though if I may not drink, I'm going to use alcohol just as an example, even though I may not drink, but I live with someone who has alcoholism, okay? They have the alcohol use disorder, right? It's out of control, they're drinking, okay? I don't drink, right? But what tends to happen is that the other person's drinking affects me, obviously, right? And if I'm not careful, I can end up being in a situation where I am controlled by my loved one's alcoholism in the same way that they are controlled, even though I'm not drinking. Because I start to develop reactions and responses, right, to the other person's use, to their situation, right? And so we're going to talk about how that can happen as you're living in close proximity with someone, and how the entire family system actually is upset. When I say upset, I don't mean angry upset, but it's derailed, right? It becomes out of whack, and actually reorganizes in such a way that it starts revolving around the person who is drinking. So when the problem behavior is introduced to the family, so we're not talking about now the person with the alcohol or drug addiction, we're talking about now the family members, okay, surrounding that individual. What happens, right? And what you're going to see is that in many ways, they're going to go through their own process, sort of similar to the person with the addiction problem, the process that they go through. They almost mirror, they're almost identical. So the first thing is the excusing of irresponsible behavior, otherwise known as denial, right? Because nobody, people have a hard time admitting that, hey, my particular loved one, has an alcohol problem, or they're addicted to drugs and that sort of thing. So they don't want to believe that. Maybe the person has done a really good job at hiding until they can't hide it anymore because it's so out of control that it becomes evident. So what are some of the ways that family members sort of show this denial? Well, embarrassment and humiliation is one. Now you say, well, wait a minute. If somebody does something that's irresponsible, that seems like a very natural response to be embarrassed by that person's behavior, right? But think about this. It's that person, their behavior, which they are responsible for, right? So my embarrassment and humiliation in some ways say that I'm taking on responsibility, right? I'm taking on the consequences that maybe that person should be experiencing, not me, because it's not me, right? So that can be an issue. Families tend to put up a good front, maybe even blame each other, right? Because if family members blame each other, then what are they saying? What they're saying is that, the person with the problem is us, not the one that's actually drinking or the one that's actually using drugs. So this becomes a way, another way to excuse behavior away. And then, of course, making excuses for the person's behavior. Things like, oh, well, they've got a really stressful job, or, they've had a tough childhood, and so forth. So those things may very well be true, right? But it is not an excuse for the behavior of drinking and using drugs. And then pretending that the pain is not very great. Here's where we deny our own painful feelings about what's happening. And we're going to talk more about that as we go on and how that manifests itself. Here is another progression in this process. So let's say we're starting with a family who have been confronted with the fact that their loved one, whether it's mom or dad or even one of the children, have a substance use disorder. They're addicted to either alcohol or drugs. So the first step is coming to terms with that, right? That oftentimes people are in denial about it. Okay, so now the second step, the second progression, the next progression, natural progression oftentimes is this enabling. And I put here home cures to remedy the problem, because we try to fix it ourselves. And that's what this is demonstrating here. These are ways in which the family members try to fix the problem themselves, right? And let's look at some of these, and you may recognize these. As we mentioned, coming up with excuses and alibis for the person's behavior. Withdrawing from sources of support. So let's say, as a family member, maybe you're used to you have places where you go, where you meet people and you have friends and that sort of thing, but you stop going. Why? Well, because the topic of conversation, you're afraid that the topic of conversation is going to be about your loved one who is obviously addicted to alcohol or drugs. And so family members will withdraw from their sources of support. They'll stop being in social circles and that sort of thing. This is an avoidance, is what is happening here. Attempts to manipulate the environment of the user, right? Hiding the keys, trying to establish rules with the mindset of trying to control the person's behavior, trying to control the person's use. Accepting the alibis of the using person. Person comes in, 3 o'clock in the morning. Hey, where you been? Oh, I just caught a flat tire, and you know that that's not true. But instead of confronting the lie, you accept that alibi. Why? Because you want the person to know that you want to believe them. And you are hopeful that if they know that you want to believe them, then that will motivate them to stop. See how that works? Blaming themselves. This is very similar to accepting the alibis of the using person. So you go to your loved one and you say, hey, I realize that I've been a terrible husband, I've been a terrible wife, I've been a terrible sister or brother or whatever, right? Wanting them to see that you accept responsibility for everything that has gone wrong, hoping that they see that and that they will in turn accept responsibility as well. This again is an attempt to try and control the other person's behavior. Attempts to shame the user. This is one that is quite common, where you may say to your loved one, you're just like your dad, or you're just like your grandmother. You're just like, attempts to shame you, hoping that they will feel bad enough to be motivated to stop. You see, enabling is not an attempt to harm. It's really an attempt to help, but it's in a harmful way, right? And so instead of making the situation better, it actually makes the situation worse. Doing things for the user they are responsible for themselves, calling off work for them, bailing them out of jail, paying for this and paying for that, things that they're responsible for themselves, you start picking up the slack for them. And then, of course, geographical cures. Here's where families will try to move. They'll try to relocate, thinking that, hey, this environment is bad. You grew up in Detroit. Let's get out of Detroit. Let's go somewhere where you don't know anyone, right? But what happens? We take ourselves with us, right? So enabling essentially doesn't work. Again, instead of getting better, the problem gets even worse. So now, as a result, consequently, there is, let me go back here. There's a progression. Is this it? Yeah, here it is. All right, so there's a progression. Why? Because you are trying to fix something on your own that you're not having success. Things are getting worse. So there is this feeling of giving up, a feeling of hopelessness. Why? Because all of your strategies, everything that you've tried, all of your emotional appeals, family members oftentimes make very heartfelt emotional appeals. But again, when we understand the nature of addiction, we understand that it's brain dysfunction, right? So those appeals aren't really getting through, right? They're not really getting through, and they're not a motivating factor for the person to get well. So there's a feeling of hopelessness because nothing's changing, right? Conflicts between the parents and other children, right? So other members of the family are at each other's throat, right? While the user, the person who is using alcohol and drugs, sort of gets away. Pretending that things are okay. Here's an important here's an important characteristic here. Members of the family take on survival roles. I want you to think about that term, a survival role, that now there's something that I'm trying to change, but it's not changing. So the best thing that I can do is find a way to survive. Find a way to live with it, right? And that forces family members to sort of take on these survival roles, which we'll talk about a little bit more here. So these survival roles are nothing more than defensive walls to hide their true feelings. Because if I share how I'm really feeling, if I share my true feelings, they're not valued, right? They're not validated, and it's going to cause constant conflict, right? And I'm fearful that if I share my true feelings, that things are going to continue to get worse anyway. So family members build up these defensive walls, and we're going to take a look now at what these walls look like. So there's a temporary reorganization that began in the previous step here with family members taking on survivor roles. Each family member adopts a survivor role. And so let's take a look here if I can get this to work for me. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's talk about the chief enabler. The chief enabler, here is what the wall looks like on the outside. Okay, and the chief enabler is normally the significant other, it's normally the spouse. Although, depending on the makeup of the family, this would be in your traditional nuclear family, right? But there are a lot of families that are not nuclear. You have blended families, you have grandparents that are raising children, so forth, so on, like that, right? And I've seen it where the grandparent has taken on the role of the chief enabler, right? So it could be, depending on the makeup of the family, the chief enabler could be anybody, but in your traditional nuclear family, the chief enabler is going to be the spouse. So the defensive wall that the spouse has on the outside is manipulation, right? Finding a way to get what they want, self-blame, right? Martyrdom. In other words, I want you to see me suffering on your behalf. This is what you're causing. You're making me do this, right? They're super responsible because the person who is using alcohol and drugs they're not responsible. They're not making responsible choices or decisions. They may be blowing the money. They may be getting into all kinds of trouble. They may be jeopardizing the household, right? So somebody's got to pick up. Somebody's got to pay the bills. Somebody's got to make sure that things are moving forward. Somebody has to make sure that the house is kept up, so forth and so on. And then self-pity in that regards. And let me go back to manipulation. Manipulation is where the chief enabler tries to manipulate the user into doing what they think the person needs to do. So that's what you see on the outside for the chief enabler. On the inside, the chief and the primary emotion of the chief enabler is anger, right? They're very resentful because you are out drinking or using drugs, and I'm at home making sure that things don't fall apart, right? I can't afford the leisure that you are taking, right? So anger. On the inside, feelings of inadequacy. On the inside, feelings of pain, feelings of guilt, feelings of hurt, and feelings of fear, right? But the defensive wall on the outside is what I want you to notice that covers up what's happening on the inside, right? In that regards, because the chief enabler has determined that, hey, I've tried to make a change here. I've tried to get them to change, but nothing's happening. Things are just getting worse instead. So what happens? I've got to find a way to live here. I've got to find a way to exist in this in this home with an individual who does not intend to stop drinking or using. All right, let me go back here. All right, so the enabler learns what not to bring up or talk about because it causes fights or tensions. Okay? And if there's children in the home, again, that's in the nuclear family. Think about this. The chief enabler will also train the children what to say and what not to say, right? And so everybody learns how to exist around the person who's using alcohol or drugs. There's a metaphor about the pink elephant, you know, the elephant in the living room that nobody wants to address. You know, it's there, it's very large, it's taking up a lot of space, it stinks, it's uncomfortable, we can't have guests over, we can't do our normal things. And initially, when that elephant comes, you know, everybody's kicking up a fuss. Everybody's saying, this is crazy, why do we have to live like this? Somebody move this elephant. But over time, people learn to move around the elephant, move through it. The smell becomes normal, right? So much so they don't really smell it anymore, right? Until one day somebody comes over to visit, right? Because they've lost they've kind of lost that sense of family or self-awareness that, hey, this is, you know, so when somebody comes over and somebody says, hey, what's going on? What's that smell? What smell? Why is that elephant there? What elephant? Right? What's the problem? So the enabler says, I'll just be quiet and not rock the boat. If I confront my daughter, she'll get mad and run away. And who will take care of her then? Okay? So now what happens is the enabler begins to internalize the fact that what they do directly impacts whether the person is going to use that day or not. So let me not do anything to make them use. Do you see the problem with that? Right? Rather than saying, hey, that person is going to decide whether they're going to use or not. I'm going to be responsible for me and allow them to be responsible for them. No, they instead are taking on responsibility. They will often use sarcasm, right? They're often sickly with headaches and low back pain, a variety of intestinal problems. Why? Once again, this is part of, you know, this is part of that martyrdom that they're showing. Hey, look at me. I'm not feeling well. Look at what's happening to me again. All right. So let's. The family mascot is next. On the outside, the wall that the mascot has is they're very humorous. This is the family clown. This is the one that keeps everybody laughing, tells all the jokes, right? Every time, even very serious matters turn into a joke, right? They do anything to attract attention. They're very hyperactive, and they're full of distractions. But on the inside, the chief emotion of the family mascot is insecurity. Very insecure. See, let me keep everyone laughing, because if I'm not laughing, then I have time to look at and become aware of my insecurity. And I'd rather just laugh I'd rather have fun than be insecure, right? They're fearful. A lot of anxiety, confusion, and loneliness. That's what's on the inside, right? That's what's on the inside. So we're painting a picture here that in family dysfunction, and by the way, I'm mentioning alcohol and drugs, but these roles can happen with any type of family dysfunction, any type of abuse, right? Can create these particular family roles here, all right? So I'm mentioning alcohol and drugs, but I want you to be aware that there are all types of dysfunctional behaviors in family that create this dynamic in the family system. The mascot is the least likely to get help in the family. They're often the youngest member of the family as well. Oftentimes the mascot may have been born maybe too early to even witness a lot of what went on. Potential to suffer from anxiety later in life is the family mascot. They become, this is an example, they may become the kind of mother that teenagers don't tell their problems to, right? Oftentimes a lot of anxiety, as we mentioned, kind of develops with the family mascot. Yes?
I'm sorry, could you go back again? Did you go over everything with the family mascot as their inside and outside? I didn't get everything.
Yes, I can go back there. Yep. Yeah.
I don't think that you talked about the hyperactivity and the distracting nature of what's happening outside.
Okay, yeah, I can go over it again. Again, this is the main defense. The main defense mechanism here is the humor, right? And so doing anything to attract attention is part of that humor, right? The mascot being hyperactive, again, if they sit still, then they have time to become aware of their insecurity, their feelings of insecurity. They don't want to do that, right? So let me go to the next thing, right? And that's where the distracting comes in as well. That it's better to laugh, it's better to just go from one laugh to the next, right? Than to take time to think about the fact that I feel really insecure in this family right now. And then those other, sure. Okay, the scapegoat is another survival role. On the outside, the wall here is that the scapegoat is the one that tends to get blamed for everything. They take the brunt of all the family troubles, right? They're considered a rule breaker. They have a strong peer value, which is really important, especially if you're when you're dealing with adolescents, because they don't have a connection with anyone at home. So they really value their relationship with their peers instead. They're seen as defiant. The scapegoat is the one that's more likely to use substances, right? And they are seen as constantly in trouble. But this sort of defiance, this behavior is really a wall. Why? Because I can't talk about what's happening at home, right? I can't really be honest, is what we're saying. I can't be honest about the fact that I feel rejected, right? Every time I get blamed for something, it validates my feeling of rejection, right? Hurt, anger, loneliness, and fear. So the scapegoat on the inside, the primary emotion, the primary emotional experience there is rejection, okay? Rejection. But the family sees them as a problem, right? These are people that may say, I was the black sheep of the family. What are they talking about? Well, this is what they're talking about here, right? They're the scapegoat. They're the one that takes the blame. They're the ones that's the trouble. They're the problem when it comes to the family. Okay, the next one is the family hero. Their wall looks like this on the outside. They work hard for approval. Now, on the outside, it's really hard to sort of criticize the family hero because they're the ones that do everything right. They're the straight A students, right? They are super responsible, right? They're the ones that if you look at them from the outside, they made it out. That's what it appears. That's what it appears. Very high achievers, follows all the rules, super responsible, but notice seeks approval. Seeks approval, right? Why are they trying so hard to do everything right, to do their very best, right? Because if I do good enough, right, then the person with the dysfunctional behavior, this alcohol and drugs, then maybe they'll stop using if I do good enough. You see that internalization of the problem? That's the problem. And on the inside, how do they feel? What's the primary emotion? Inadequacy. I'm working so hard at being the best I can be because on the inside, I really don't feel good enough. Because if I were good enough, then these problems would not persist. They would not exist, right? And so that's the issue there. So inadequacy, guilt, and hurt, right? So on the outside, they may look very good, may look very attractive, but we can't be fooled by that. It's a wall. It's a wall, right? And this next slide is very interesting here because these heroes, they're usually the firstborn, right? I'm a firstborn, by the way. Feels the burden to fill the unfulfilled wishes of their parents, right? They're going to be everything that their parents couldn't be, right? And everything that their parents wanted them to be. They're going to fulfill that, right? They take on the feeling of wanting to bring self-worth to the chemically dependent family. So they're going to be the ones to show, right, that, hey, we're look at us, you know, I represent the best of the family. First objective person who sits outside of the painful spot. Okay? So they don't sit there in the pain. The scapegoat runs away. The mascot creates a lot of humor, a lot of distraction, right? The hero is going to escape perhaps through education. They're going to escape through these high pursuits, right? And so that they take a position where they look back on the family, and that even though they're a part of, right? But what they've done is they've found other ways to be able to sort of distract themselves so that they don't have to really sit with that feeling of inadequacy. Notice here, they're high value systems. They tend to be perfectionists. Heroes tend to be counselors, doctors, nurses, teachers, and clergy are often the family heroes, right? Now, again, this is not black and white. This is not everybody who's a counselor or a nurse or doctor. That's not what I'm saying. But, you know, this represents their high pursuit, right? What are they trying to do? They're trying to fill the void of inadequacy, of feeling inadequate, right? Inadequacy develops when they learn that there is nothing that they can do about the situation. Why? Because you can't change another person's behavior. You can't change another person's desire to drink or desire to use drugs. You can't change that in another person. You can only change yourself. So when they realize that their very best attempts to be super successful is not enough, inadequacy, right? Inadequacy. Then there's the lost child. The lost child, what does their wall look like on the outside? Shy, quiet, independent, and solitary. Attaches to things rather than people. The family system teaches them, don't trust. Okay? We'll talk about the three unwritten rules of the dysfunctional family. Don't trust, don't feel, and don't talk. Don't talk because nobody will listen. Don't feel because my feelings, my true feelings, will never be validated. These inner feelings right here will never be validated, right? And don't trust the good times because the bad times are just around the corner. They're coming. They're coming. So you can't trust it. You can't trust it. So they're independent and solitary. They're attached to things rather than people. They get lost in a fantasy life. And when you think about fantasy life, think about the type of things that represent fantasy life. Television, video games, right? These types of things. Again, I'm not saying everyone, but you know, it's no coincidence that today that people are consumed, you know, with fantasy. People are consumed with fantasy, right? And they're very withdrawn. The lost child could be in their room for hours. They won't come out. You won't even know that they're home. Where they get. I mean, you don't even think about them because they're not visible, right? They prefer to be alone, so forth and so on. On the inside, how do they feel? The primary emotion is rejection. They feel rejected, hurt, anxiety, loneliness, and anger, right? But the primary emotion is really the rejection that they feel from the family, right? Which is why they just resort to being by themselves, right? And seem comfortable that way as well. Much more accepting of their unimportance is the lost child. They're likely to become a loner. They have difficulty separating fantasy from reality, right? And that makes a lot of sense because fantasy was their go-to, you know? This fantasy world was sort of their main coping mechanism, right? So of course, you know, they're gonna have issues separating the two. However, they see both sides of everything, okay? Why? Well, because a large part of their life has spent apart from the family. They have put some distance there, right? So they've learned to see both sides. The inability to form relationships. They learn that it's safer to be tied to things. Safer to be tied to things rather than people. And of course, again, the inability to form relationships. And then there is the person that the entire system revolves around. And that is the person who is using alcohol or drugs, or the person that may be, you know, addicted to pornography, or the person that might be addicted to gaming, or the person that may be, you know, wreaking havoc in the family through abuse and irresponsible living, right? What does their defensive wall look like, right? Hostile. And think about why that is. Because you make me angry. And when you make me angry, that's my excuse to go drink, right? So I'm going to use that. They're also grandiose. Grandiose means that they just have a sense that the world sort of revolves around them, right? That they're the most important thing in the whole system. Can be very charming, very rigid values, but also manipulative. And I gave you just what I said to you was an example of the manipulation there. I want you to believe that what you do or don't do is my biggest trigger to go use, right? And you just can't seem to get it right. So here I go, right? And so you in turn come home and you're now walking on eggshells because you don't know what to say. You don't know what not to say, right? One day is this, the next day is something else. There's no consistency. When really I'm just using that. I'm using that, right? On the inside, what is their primary emotion? Shame, because addiction is very shame-based, right? The first consequence usually that a person experiences when they struggle with addiction is that the way that they see themselves, the way they think about themselves changes. When they look in the mirror, they don't see the same person. They don't feel the same way. They feel a sense of shame, right? And they won't talk about that or anything. Instead, they'll get angry. Why? Because it's easier to get angry than to feel shameful, right? So shame, guilt, hurt, pain, and even fear, right? These walls are very thick. These walls are very rigid. Once they form, it's very difficult to get out of them, but recovery, of course, is possible. At least now we see that recovery needs to happen, not just for the person who has alcoholism or drug addiction, but recovery needs to happen for the entire family. All right, more reaction, escape attempts. So if you remember, the reaction of the family started out with denial, right? Then it went to enabling. Then it went to reorganization, thus taking on survival roles, right? Now it progresses. The family dynamics progress to escape attempts. In other words, this is a family saying, I got to get out of here. I can't live like this anymore. So what happens? Separation or divorce. Now, I'm not saying that this may not be an option that makes sense. We have to look at why. What's the reason why what's your motive behind doing this, right? Are you doing this to get away, or are you doing this to convince the other person, the person who is using that, that they need to get well? Are you doing this in order not to deal with what has happened to you, right? And your emotional state or condition. Oftentimes people experience this, they'll escape, they'll get out of the family, get out of the relationship, and guess what? Go get right into another relationship. Because they were the problem, not realizing that, okay, yes, but you have now developed an issue. You have built up a wall around yourself. And so now guess what? Second marriage, it comes out, right? Third marriage, it comes out, right? Because you haven't addressed your issues. Teen pregnancy, I've seen this. Suicide attempts, this is where this comes into phrase. So you can see that's a lot of mental health that's built into this process, right? It's a lot of mental health here. Early marriages, right? Staying away from home. Some people just won't come home, don't talk to anybody in the family. I just have to get completely away. And then again, alcohol and drug use. And I've seen it where for some people in families, they start using, right? They start using right along with the individual who originally began using alcohol and drugs as a way to try and sort of connect, but also start using as a way to escape and forget about the pain and just to get away. All right, the next progression is attempts to reorganize, okay? When there is intervention, and this is really the first sign that Whole families get sick, but whole families can get well. We've also discovered here, based on what we've gone through, is that we're dealing with addiction that not only affects an individual, but actually affects an entire family. It's a family illness, right? It's a family illness. And so family members as well now have a responsibility to accept and recognize what has happened to them, right? And that can be very difficult because family members, their response, oftentimes, you're talking to me, I don't have the problem, they have the problem. That's who you need to be talking to, right? And they have a hard time or even refuse to accept what has happened to them in the process, right? So increased efforts to socialize is part of, so families function a certain way. The system now reorganizes because they've got to figure out how to survive. Now, time for them to reorganize again because the way they organized in the beginning was not very healthy. So increased efforts to socialize, this is when the family may start to reach out for help. Help starts to intervene because they've kind of withdrawn from everyone else. And so now there's increased efforts to socialize, cutting the user off from contact with the family, right? Now, how can this be something that's positive? It's the motive behind it. I'm not going to cut you off because I'm hoping that by me cutting you off, you will see that you need to get yourself together. That's still me trying to control your behavior. I'm cutting you off because it is in my best interest. I need to take care of me and put me first, and I haven't been doing that. I've been putting you first, and I'm no longer willing to sacrifice myself for you. That's the right motive, not because I'm hoping that you'll see that you're completely lost and need to change. Now I'm still trying to control you. Does that make sense? I'm still trying to control your behavior. It's never going to happen that way. Okay. Let me hurry up here. So recovery begins with this reorganization, the reorganization of the entire family. The family system allows for help to intervene. This is counseling. This is support groups, right? Treatment is accepted for the dependent person, all right? Or treatment is accepted for the codependent family members. Either way, it's going to upset the family system, right? And I always tell clients, tell families that it's possible for the person with the dependency, with the chemical dependency, to get well and the family remains sick. So that when I come out of treatment, what am I coming home to? Who am I coming home to? I'm coming home to a family that still have these defensive walls, right? And it's not a very healthy environment at all. Or it's possible for the person who's addicted to whatever dysfunctional behavior not to accept treatment, but the family decides we're going to get well, right? Doesn't matter, right? Somebody has to get well. Somebody has to accept some help and treatment and intervention. Policies and rules begin to be established by the family. Oftentimes where the family struggles the most is you don't have any place to live, you don't have anything to eat, right? You are in dire need, and you're knocking on my door or calling me on the phone, and I have to tell you no. There are conflicted feelings there. On the one, I must tell you no because I know in the past when I've given in, it did not help. I actually made things worse. And that's another thing families oftentimes begin to realize, that wow, I became the enabler. I gave money, right? I protected them from the consequences of their behavior. I did that. I was actually funding their use. I was funding their habit, right? And I mean, it takes a lot of courage to come to that realization and be willing to admit that, right? And now, part of that as well is realizing that I have to tell you no. I have to see you suffer, right? But I must tell you no. And then I must deal with my guilty feelings because I feel guilty now that I told you no. But I've got to work through that, and that can be very hard because they're begging, they're pleading, but you know that it's the addiction talking, right? To manipulate and to use and that sort of thing. And so to work through that, I can't do that by myself. That's a very difficult thing to do alone, right? You don't know if you're making the right decision or not. You don't know if you're helping or hurting, right? But you know that you can't continue to do what you've been doing, right? And so even when you make the right decision, there's a feeling of guilt. And this is why it's really important to understand that feelings aren't facts, right? Feelings aren't necessarily facts. You know, our feelings can deceive us, right? Our feelings can deceive us. So we got to be careful about that. So, and some people say, oh, you have to show them tough love. Well, again, am I trying to control their behavior, even with that, right? I personally don't really like the term tough love because I think it conveys that, you know, I'm trying to still control your behavior. I just like the term love. I've got to love myself and I got to love you, but I have to love you from a distance, right? All right, so we're almost done here. The dysfunctional family system, it is systemic. Each person reacts to another person in the system, whether it's the enabler, the hero, the mascot, the lost child, or the scapegoat, right? Picture a wheel turning in the middle, which is the person who's addicted to substances, and all the rest of the wheels around turn based on the turning of that wheel in the center, right? And so the family has learned to sort of function this way. The family system, deluded, full of self-deception, believing what is not true, and unaware of the survival role. Many people grow up into adulthood unaware that they are adult children of alcoholics. They have these survival roles, these defense mechanisms still, right? But they're unaware of it. Compulsive, feeling of being driven to specific behavior. These are characteristics of the system. It is individualistic in that each family member can be characterized by specific behavior. It is also destructive in that each family member pays a price to survive. They pay a price to survive. All right. And in closing here, the 3 C's of family recovery is for family members to accept that you did not cause it, that you cannot control it, and you certainly cannot cure it. That is really important, right? Because so much time is spent trying to control another person's behavior, thinking that there's something that I can do, there's something that I can say, there must be to help, right? But the reality is that addiction is not something that I caused, right? Addiction is not something that I can control. The history tells that, and I certainly cannot cure it, right? And so I've got to accept that. I've got to accept that in order for me to create some healthy space, boundaries between me and the person who I love, but is struggling there. All right, and finally, this is the last one. Nurturing families, people feel free to talk about inside feelings. In my family, it's okay for me to say that, hey, I'm really angry right now, and here's why, right? Or I feel rejected, or I feel this, or I feel that, right? All feelings are okay. None are off limit. It's okay to talk about anything, right? There are no topics that are hush hush. Don't talk about that, right? It's okay for family members to be different, to have different thoughts and different feelings, to have different points of views. It's okay to think differently and be an individual, right? It's okay for each person to accept responsibility for their own actions. I don't have to accept responsibility for your actions, and you don't have to accept responsibility for mine, right? That's dangerous to do that. There are very few shoulds in the family, shoulds, oughts, or must, right? And these represent expectations and pressures that we often put on ourselves or put on our family members about who they must be or how they must perform. And that can be very dangerous. The atmosphere is relaxed and joyous. Members feel loved and valued. People have high self-worth. And this is very important, this last one. People are stroked for who they are, not for what they do. My approval of you is not based on your performance. My approval of you is based on who you are as a human being, who you are as my child, who you are as my wife, who you are as my husband, whatever, who you are as an individual. You don't have to do anything to earn that, right? When it is performance-based and I fail to meet those expectations, then that's when we start sowing the seeds for the dysfunction there. And that can be problematic. So these are the characteristics of nurturing families. And we're going to stop right there. Tomorrow we'll go in and we'll talk about codependency, which oftentimes develops in families who struggle with these types of issues. Are there any questions? Yes.
I imagine these roles can overlap.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. They certainly can. They certainly can. You could be both. You can have a little bit of both in you, you know, and most people do. Most people see that. Yeah. Yeah. So, any others?
Yes, the scapegoat, you said takes on the blame, and some of the things that you mentioned, and their walls, the inside and the outside of rejection, hurt, anger, loneliness, fear. They're usually the rule breaker, defiant, strong peer value. They even I guess they're troubled, and I think it also said they suffer some substance abuse. Is this person the scapegoat of the family that's dealing with a person who's suffering from addiction, usually the person who has the greatest portion in identity crisis?
That's a good question. I would imagine that that the scapegoat has an issue with belonging. Because I get blamed for everything, you know, and so I sort of get used to that, and maybe, and this I think leans into what you're saying, maybe I embrace that because that's all I have, you know.
Is there a sense of belonging
Yeah,
to the family?
absolutely. Since that's how you see me, right? That's how you see me. Then let me just take that role because that's the only thing that I'm getting. Yeah, I'm not getting anything else. So let me take that role. And yeah. So they may tend to embrace that, and I've seen it where family member has embraced that all the way until they died. You know, that was who they were, and it was like there was some sort of pride in that. You know, I'm the black sheep of the family. You know, nobody really listens to me anyway, type of thing. And so it's very unfortunate, very sad to see that they never really found themselves. You know, and say, hey, you may see me that way, but this is who I am.
Right.
You know, and if you continue to choose to do that, that's on you. But I'm not going to let that sort of determine who I am.
Yeah,
you know?
that's exactly what I was saying.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned something in your talk about those who, you know, the new family members who learn how to deal with this person who's dealing with substance abuse, and I labeled it as hereditary adaptation. You know, we're taught how to deal with, oh yeah, Uncle Charlie, before they even get to know
That's right.
Uncle Charlie.
That's right. Because we pass it on. What we learn, we pass on. And even if it's a dysfunctional way of operating, that's what we pass on to our children, to our offspring, grandchildren. We just pass it on, unfortunately. And we never really create a culture of, you know, what it means to have a nurturing family. And it's not to say that nurturing families don't have problems, right? I mean, we're human beings, so there are issues. But it's not about having the problem. Our goal here is to eliminate problems. Our goal is to recognize them, not be in denial about them, and confront them in a healthy way. That's the goal. It's about how you deal with it. It's not about having it, it's about how you deal with it. And so how are we gonna deal with it? Is Uncle Charlie gonna be the joke of the family because he's always drunk and everybody ignores? Is that what we're gonna do? You know, or we're gonna say, hey, you know what? This not acceptable. We're not gonna make fun. We're gonna actually have some compassion. We're gonna take care of ourselves and, you know, encourage Uncle Charlie to get some help.
So how do we do that from a nurturing position with new family members without creating stigmas and bias?
Yeah, well, and I think part of this is we talk about everything. So we have conversations. One of the most powerful things that we can do in family is have conversations. Let's have discussions. You see, oftentimes what happens is, you know, I don't really want my kids to do alcohol and drugs ever. So I either never talk about it or I talk about it in a way where everything that I say about it is negative. You know what that does, right? That just piques the curiosity. You know, that just piques curiosity. You know, that happens with alcohol and drugs, that happens with sex, that happens with things that, you know, we may feel that, hey, I wasn't raised that. We didn't talk about that sort of thing at the table. So now we pass that on. No, we're going to have an open conversation. We're going to have an open dialogue, right? Because the reality is that we may not be talking about it at home, but you're learning it at school.
Precisely.
Because your friends are talking about it, right? Or you're seeing it on television or whatever. So let's have a conversation about it, right? And I think that is one of the most powerful things that we can do, an honest and open conversation, you know? Yep. So, yes.
So I really truly appreciate everything that you're saying. I am having trouble, and I always will have trouble believing that addiction is not a choice.
Mm.
And I say that because I was, surrounded by a gambler who made the choice that they made. I have neighbors with drug addictions, things like that. They can make a choice doing other things. They can go steal from me, they can go, do other things, but yet you're telling me that they can't choose, to not take that drink or to not take that drug or whatever. And ultimately, you're saying that then they can't choose Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So it really bothered me that to say that addiction is not a choice.
Yeah.
I understand that some of these chemicals and stuff can affect the brain in such a way that it starts deteriorating, no different than honestly dementia or Alzheimer's or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
That can happen with certain things in life that you do to yourself. But it's always going to bother me, and I don't know if I'll ever be convinced, but I would like to understand a little bit more that addiction is not a choice, because then you're saying that they can't choose Jesus.
Yeah. No, thank you for bringing that up, because that's, people really do. You're not the only one that kind of struggles with that. So let me preface what I'm about to say by saying this. Just because addiction is not a choice, and I'm going to define exactly what that means, does not mean that an individual is not responsible, right? That's not what we're saying. So when we say that addiction is not a choice, what we're saying is that, I don't, when I was in first grade, right? I think you go to first grade around 6 or 7, right? Somewhere around there, teacher asks you, you have career day, what do you want to be? I guarantee you, nobody's raising their hand saying, I want to be hooked and strung out on heroin. I want to be, addicted to alcohol to the point where I drink myself into cirrhosis of the liver. I want to gamble to the point where I spend all my money and devastate my family and have my marriage end in divorce. People aren't choosing that. So the question is, how do we get there? How does a person get there, right? If that's not what they're choosing. And so while there is the initial choice to pick up the drink or the drug or to engage in a habit, what we're saying is that the nature of the way our brains work, right, is that our brain is a learning mechanism. It's a learning organ. And what it learns, it adapts to. And when I make a conscious decision over and over and over, and a decision that overstimulates the brain, my brain's natural reaction is to adapt to that so that it makes that choice easier. Now I didn't plan on that. I didn't plan on that. Oftentimes what we discuss when I'm talking with clients is, when did you cross the line? Nobody knows. We don't know the day or the hour we crossed the line. We just knew that at some point it was exciting, it was for fun, I was in control, and then at some point I wasn't. And I look back and I said, how did I get here, right? How did I get here? And so that's what we're saying. We're saying that the brain operates in such a way that it actually cooperates with what you're doing so that it is easier for you to do. And once you reach that point, now you have something inside of you, right, that is assisting in a behavior that you may even want to stop doing and get away from. But the problem is the brain has learned it so well that everywhere in your environment is a reminder of this particular behavior, right? We call that triggers, cues in the environment that trigger thoughts and feelings to return to the behavior. Not only that, when I'm not engaging in the behavior, I'm not myself. I'm not normal. I don't feel right. I don't think right. I'm not motivated. Nothing makes sense to me, right? Because the brain has learned that if we're going to feel normal, we need that substance. We need that particular behavior. That's the only way we're going to feel normal. And now I feel like, well, now it becomes a matter of, in spite of the consequences, now it becomes a matter really of survival. I need it, right? Now, when intervention comes along and somebody says, hey, when a person comes to a point where they have a realization through consequences, natural consequences, that sort of thing, that what is happening is destructive and it has completely changed them, there's an opportunity to now make a different choice. It's possible to do that, and people do it all the time. What I'm saying is that there's usually a long process that happens before a person gets there. It's a little bit longer for some than others. Some people, I've talked to people where it took a year, some 2 years, others 10 years, right? To come to that. They were so driven. See, there's a part of our brain that controls our drive. And I'm talking about our drive to eat, our drive to sleep. You're only going to go so long without putting some food in your body. Okay? And then it's going to hurt, right? You're only going to go so long without putting water in your body. You have an instinctual drive to do that. And what I'm saying is that the brain so changes that pleasure is on an equal level with survival. So it's not even a matter of feeling good anymore. It's a matter of survival. And there's something in me that's driving me towards that, right? That other people may not understand, but that's what's happening. Yes, I see my wife hurting. You think I want my wife crying? No, I'm not trying to do that on purpose. But I got to figure out, how do I get out of this hamster wheel? How do I get out of here, right? And I think the way that happens is through connection, right? And cooperation, meaning that I have to allow you to help me. I have to allow somebody to help me, right? And that's challenging, yet it's possible. And what we want to do is just create a community where we say, hey, it's possible. It's possible. I can't choose for you. You're going to have to do this, right? I know people that drove up to the treatment center and sat in the parking lot for hours and drove away. Others drove up to the treatment center and ran in, right? Because they had reached that point for them that say, hey, I got to do something here, right? And I think that happens different for everyone. So that's what we mean when we say, hey, it's not a choice. Is a person choosing to use? Yes, but that choice is very much loaded with the changes that have taken place in the brain. That's all we mean there, because at the end of the day, they are responsible. I treated a man who was drinking and driving and never got caught. And the one time he killed somebody. And that was it. Stop drinking, but now you're going to prison. You didn't have to take that, but that's what it took, And so I think for different, everybody's different, everybody's different, but certainly, we talk mostly about alcohol and drugs and these things. I mentioned behaviors, and you mentioned a behavior with gambling. I do think that many people are overly stimulated by a lot of things. And I think addiction is more prevalent than just alcohol and drugs. You know what I'm saying? We can talk about a lot of different things that people find themselves. We're going to talk tomorrow about codependency, relationship. How do you just keep getting into a relationship with the same type of individual? Different person, same issues though. How does that keep happening? What are you not seeing? What's happening there, right? And what we find is that the brain responds the same way to those type of issues as it does to alcohol or drugs. So how do we get out of that? That type of thing. So I hope that helps a little bit in that regard. But I do think that when people say, yeah, it's not a choice, they don't really just explain what that means, because they know I see that, yeah, right? But what's going into that? Why is that happening? As human beings, if we put our hand on fire, it's going to burn. We have a natural reaction to snatch it back. But here, I put my hand on fire, it burns, but I wonder if I can do it again. And see, something's wrong there. That doesn't make sense, right? What is going haywire here that I keep having this reaction? So, yeah. Okay, all right. Well, listen, I hope that, I know our time is way gone. I promise we won't take this long next time, but I hope it was helpful. I hope you come back. I hope you bring someone as we talk about these things that need to be talked about. So, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yep, we'll be back here. Antonio. Tomorrow, 6:30, and bring somebody. Let me pray for you as you go home, that you will stay warm and blessed. All right. Father in heaven, thank you for the things that we have heard this evening. I pray that as we continue to process through these things, it help us to be better informed and educated, see ourselves, the people that we are in relationships with, our families, etc. And I pray ultimately that the outcome would lead to better versions of us, better and healthier families. Now be with each of us as we return to our homes tonight. Take us there safely in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.
Thank you.
Yeah.